Well, let's now speak to Beiruti businessman Tarek Chalhoub and the podcaster Ronnie Chatah, who was also the son of the economist and diplomat Mohammed Chatah, who was assassinated in 2013. Let's start with you, Tarek, if I may. Echoes here today of Lebanon's painful past, a collapsing economy, political paralysis, and now bloodshed on the streets of Beirut. The worry must be tonight that Lebanon is sliding back into the sectarian violence we saw in the 70s and the 80s.
Exactly. Good evening, Mr. Ronnie also. Sir, briefly, I can, in few words, I can describe what is really happening in Lebanon. What is happening today in Lebanon is the result of what is called or what is known as the pact with the devil. We all know how this covenant ends, and these are the signs that the end of the understanding with Hezbollah and President Michel Aoun. Unfortunately, the president of the republic today has become a team member and supporter to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has taken hostage the future of the Lebanese in the service of Iran interests. So all this, the impact of all this has led us to witness what happened today in the streets of our beloved capital, Beirut.
Let me throw that then to Ronnie. Tarek is just referring to it as a pact with the devil. Is that how you perceive it?
I'll add to what Tarek has said. I think this is less reminiscent of the Civil War. I think it's more reminiscent of May 2008. And the reason I'm choosing that specific month and year is because that is when we saw Hezbollah engage in armed battles across Beirut in an attempt to preserve its security proxy dominion, something that it's worked very hard at establishing. And anytime there's a threat to that security framework, whether it's back in 2008 against firing an airport security official closely allied to Hezbollah, or trying to dismantle a telecommunications network that they were using, or today with the port blast investigation, they seem to go on the offensive readily. And what we saw today was unfortunately a reminder of how easy things can spiral out of control. Add to that, the location is quite tragic. This is the old Khat Tames, the old Green Line of Beirut that divided West Beirut from East Beirut for 15 years, 1975 to 1990. But I do not think it's a return to civil war per se. I think it's actually something that's harder, which is a perpetual proxy paralysis, which we're living in right now.
Indeed, a painful reminder of 2008. And for you personally, Ronnie, there must be a reminder there of 2013 when your father was assassinated. A reminder, perhaps, that although the Civil War, as you say, ended in 1990, the violence continues and is still the unrest is still a daily part of life in Lebanon, isn't it? What's your take on today's events in the context of the last 20 years?
Well, unfortunately, political violence did not end with the end of the Civil War. And that is a big tragedy for the reconstruction, rehabilitation of the Lebanese state. Many decades ago, we lost sovereignty. No monopoly of violence in this country. That eroded in 1970. Once militia begets militia, once you have a multitude of competing factions, the state breaks down. And that's what happened in 1975. Today, however, it's political violence, albeit at a far reduced scale, that does not diminish from the port blast, which is definitely part of that story. But the type of violence we're seeing right now is not militia against militia, or for that matter, armed groups competing with each other the way they did in the 1980s, at the start of this conversation. It's one militia that's able to circumvent the Lebanese state when needed and chase down its opponents when needed. And that's a very different situation. That's actually, in a way, it guarantees that there's no return to civil war. It also guarantees that the Lebanese state survives. It wobbles. It's very difficult to reform with a sub-state group like Hezbollah, but it's still intact, which means there's no return to civil war, but there's perpetual paralysis. And in the story of impunity, which is really what this is all about, unfortunately, it's part of our daily lives. There is a group that gets away with crimes. And unfortunately, that is a consistent reminder.
Tarek, Ronnie's just been saying there that this isn't a return to civil war, but the parallels are there, aren't there? Economic collapse, political incompetency on an industrial scale, unrest on the streets. The parallels are really there if you want to look at them, aren't they?
Yes, true. Normally, like you just mentioned, economically, we are not fine at all. We spent more than $40 billion. This is $40 billion, not $400, not $4 billion. We spent $4 billion. The Lebanese taxpayers spent $40 billion to have electricity. They spent all that money, and all that money disappeared. We have no electricity now. We have around 2 to 3 hours a day electricity. Our kids, they need to study. They need to have the electricity. You know, the electricity is the major things in our life. So economically, we are in a very, very bad situation. And all of that is due to what has Hezbollah drew as a program to get over the Lebanese government. So Hezbollah finally is having all the head of the states. He's defending the mafia, and Hezbollah as an armed militia is acting on the ground to defend all this mafia.
Tarek, we've been talking about the similarities here between what's happening now and what happened in the 70s and 80s, but the world is a very different place from what it was then. The geopolitics in the region are very different now. What sort of support do you think Lebanon needs now from its neighbours in order to avoid falling down the same pit that it did in the 70s and the 80s?
Exactly. We are in 2021. If we look to our neighboring countries, in the Gulf countries, now you cannot compare the Lebanese situation to the other situation. For me, it's very easy and simple. We need international forces to disarm Hezbollah in order to secure our own survival in Lebanon and to prevent the destruction of our future. We have been into war from 75 to 1990, and then we had the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, and then they started eliminating everybody from one side. The 14th of March, reaching our noble MP, Dr. Chatah. I mean, how can you deal with a party that has a gun or has a bomb on the table and is telling you, let's go forward to build a country? You cannot build a country, never. You can never build a country with a militia. We need international forces to disarm Hezbollah. That way we can build our Lebanon, the Lebanon that our kids deserve.
Ronnie, what's the feeling tonight on the streets of Beirut?
I will share the feeling, which is rather bleak, but I'll just add a bit to what Tarek was saying, that there's a real fear that the culmination of May 2008 may actually resume. What Lebanon experienced was something called forced national unity, which really means Hezbollah dominion. And that means you're not addressing the core issue that faced Lebanon when this country tore itself apart in 1975. So there has to be an emphasis, whether it's the regional sphere or the international community in their dealings with Iran, that Lebanon's sovereignty has to be on the table in a proactive, foreign policy of neutrality that's respected by the region, by the world, and by Lebanese. Now I'll go into the very local and what's happening right now. I live a few minutes from where the video footage was shared. That's in Tayuni. That's literally a few minutes away from here. Beirut is a small city. We're familiar with this type of turf war, unfortunately. The roads are empty. The traffic lights have stopped working many months ago. The street lights are out. Beirut is dark. It's an eerie, unfortunate reminder that the worst years of civil strife, they're not that long ago. And if things were to degenerate to the point that there is one day an effective armed opposition to this proxy militia, you then may see a scenario that is uncontrollable by Hezbollah, by Hezbollah's allies, by Hezbollah's sponsor, and by Hezbollah's opponents. So that's the worst case scenario that everyone should avoid. At the same time, that's not in Lebanon's hands. Lebanese cannot control this problem. You have a judge right now, Tarek trying to pursue a limited investigation into the largest non-nuclear blast in modern history. He began approaching the outer realm of the regime, and Hezbollah said that's far enough. This is not a group that's domestic. This is not a local Lebanese militia. This is a regional army sponsored by Iran. To get to justice, there has to be a regional understanding that Lebanese cannot handle this problem on their own. Unfortunately, otherwise, it would have been solved years ago.
Tarek Chalhoub and Ronnie Chatah, thank you both very much indeed for joining me.